historical fiction has always been one of my faves, mostly because I feel like it gives me the emotional aspects that my elders would not talk about.
Mm,
Um so it's easy for me to sit and read something like Coleman Hill in one sitting
mhm.
because I want to hear them. Like
Yeah.
trauma be damned, right? Like trauma be damned. I got my own trauma that I probably could write a 300-400
Mm-hmm.
page book about
Mhm.
easily, right? But I feel like the trauma is just a catalyst for like all, specifically on the page, the trauma is a catalyst for all of these other conversations that explain so much about our people and the way
Of
that we
course.
live lives today. That is interesting to me, that it is a page turner, because
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, this, it makes sense now. Like
I
all
Mhm,
the
mhm.
things
yeah.
that they wouldn't say or still won't talk about, you know,
Yeah. Yeah.
we get in
I really
historical fiction.
appreciate that. I really
Yeah.
appreciate because, my people, obviously they were talking, not not everybody, but my ancestors, or not my ancestors, my living relatives were talking. That's how I wrote this book because I heard all these stories since I was a kid. They
Mm,
didn't necessarily know that we were listening all the time, because some of the stories they talked about, was horrific. The things that these kids went through, like abuse from their grandmother and so forth. But they were talking and they
yeah.
talked, told the same stories over and over again. So, yeah, so for me, that was never an issue. I always had history surrounding me from being a
Mm,
young child, and just hearing about these old days, the good and the bad, like not just the abuse and everything, but just like how people lived back then, which was so different from me. Like I didn't grow up listening to the radio and hearing stories, on the radio, or like having an ice box, for example, which my parents, they called the refrigerator the ice box. I never even realized what it looked like until I was writing Coleman Hill. And I was like, wait, what is an icebox? I don't even know what it looks like. Oh, that's what it looks like. Oh, so I always grew up with these old timey terms in my household. So yeah, that was never an issue for me.
See, and my mother is like the family historian. My mom has
Mm-hmm.
all the pictures. She knows all the stories. She
Mm-hmm.
can tell us, at least for like my great grandfather's side of the family, my great grandmother's side of the family is like a little iffy. We know
Yeah.
some, but my mom has always made my elders real for me. The ones
Mm,
that passed before me, like they are very, very clear in my mind. But also, there are things that I wish I could have asked them personally,
sure.
that like my mother's perspective of them um maybe doesn't give the full gamut, right? Because our perspectives
Sure.
are our own. Um so that's really why, like stuff like this, Jess and I
yeah. It doesn't
eat
bother
up a
me
historical,
similar.
yeah, it doesn't.
Yeah.
A lot of the times we have to warn authors like we are broken, like don't use us as a
Yeah.
parameter for how traumatic something is, because we just be like, yeah, okay,
Yeah, it is
next.
like what's the tea? Like what is it?
Right.
Like really what's going? Cuz like
Yeah.
yeah, like I enjoy listening to my grandfather, my grandma, all their
Mhm.
stories and all those type of things and like listening to the backstories of that. I enjoy that type of stuff. Even though it's deemed kind of, traumatic in some ways, but
Mhm.
it's like similar to what Shelby's saying, somebody has to be honestly the historian to hold these truths
Yes.
and to unravel them and to talk about them, to keep them
Yes.
alive. Because how are we supposed to heal generationally if we're not
Exactly.
literally talking about it? Somebody got to talk
Exactly.
about it, somebody got to
Somebody.
read it, and we'll read it.
And I
Somebody.
appreciate that, about the unraveling and the making connections, because
Mhm.
I've tried not to read a lot of reviews, in response to Coleman Hill, but
Yeah.
sometimes I'll see people talking about like, oh, there's so much abuse, there's so much trauma. And the thing
Mm,
is, I always, emphasize that I didn't write this book as trauma porn. I didn't
yeah.
write this book to say, look, Black people suffered, my family suffered, all this horrible crap happened to us. It's about making those connections to slavery, how some of this
Hmm.
abuse has roots, within slavery. It's making the connections about intergenerational trauma and abuse.
Yeah.
And it's also making that connection or bringing, emphasizing how Black people sometimes even, deem certain neglectful or harmful things as our culture, and we're proud of it. Proud of the
Right.
fact that I whoop my child. Proud, and so making those connections that, you know what, some of these things are maladaptive, and some of
You
these things
know,
that we consider love are not really positive and helpful, for ourselves, for our children, for the future generations. So that's why I wrote this book, to emphasize those things, not to just throw abuse and trauma and pain at people and re-traumatize, our people. It's to make people see the connections and also make people see the connections within their own families.
right.
Like some of
Yeah.
the stuff is happening to you that you've normalized,
Right.
and maybe you can take a step back and say, wait a second, this doesn't feel so good after all.
Absolutely. Something that a close friend of mine and I talked about like some months ago, because I was having a conversation about James by Percival Everett and how it is a phenomenal book,
Oh.
and the things that he talks about, the way that he took this story and still was able to pay ode to the writing style and the content but still make it his own is phenomenal. And they were like, oh, I read it and it's just trauma porn. And I called one of my friends after this conversation and I was like irate, because I'm like, why can't we see things outside of how they make us feel? And my friend said to me, it's a lack of critical thinking. She was like, they don't want to think. They don't want to see things outside of how they feel. So it's trauma porn because that gives them an out. And that's what helps me when I see things like that, because true comprehension is being able to see the possibility of words, and the possibility of words is way outside of just the definitions that so
Yeah.
that helps
Yeah.
me when I
I
see
definitely
the use
also
of certain things. What were you gonna say, Jess?
Yeah. I also see it as like bibliotherapy. Like how we had Emily on, and she was talking about bibliotherapy and some of the books that she uses to guide her patients through the work. I think these are the type of books that should be used as bibliotherapy for people to understand multi-generational trauma that is happening. And I think true comprehension, people are not going to get it because these books are going to be written off as like, why are we, and same thing with movies as well. We always talk about that. Why do we have so much trauma porn? Why do we have so much this? Well, our history at the end of the day, unfortunately, is rooted in trauma. But there is joy. There's different aspects that we're seeing that is coming out. And if you give it a try, there's so many avenues for us to dive down and for us to open our mind to. But a lot of people aren't yet, which it takes time. It takes time.
Yeah. We're all in different places, especially with reading. I try to remind myself that too, that like where I am as a reader is not where everybody else is. So the way that I intake a book and the way that I see a book is very subjective to me and my life experience, right? And who I'm trying to become and all of those kind of things. And that's the same for everybody else.
Yes. Yeah.
Because I really be wanting to be like, just read it anyway. Do it anyway.
It's a good book. It's a good book. Just read it.
But especially what you said about love, there's so many overt things happening in this book, but also subversive things. And I just wish personally more people would focus on those things, So like, there's a whole chapter that's titled Love. I forget what it is. Love is, love ain't. So like looking at sisterly love, for example, a little sister who protects her big sister from her husband, abusive husband, right? And looking at how this little sister takes on a mothering role towards her nieces and nephews, when they're essentially abandoned. And how this woman also, refuses to accept abuse from men so much that she doesn't even marry anyone. She's not going to let, herself be controlled. So, and I also talk about my grandmother, my mother's mother, who, she was a dark-skinned, heavy-set woman. And the fact that this is a woman who dreams about being loved. Like, when is the last time, obviously we have more representations in books, but when is the last time you saw a movie about a dark-skinned Black woman, heavy-set Black woman who got to be just thinking about love, and thinking about romance, so
Yeah.
some of these things, it's like, okay, these are in there. And at the same time, this is someone who's criticizing, a dark-skinned man. Oh, I don't want him because he's too dark. So looking at all these complexities and the way that we identify ourselves, identify other people, but there's just so much going on. There's so many layers. It's not just like one thing, which I also like just want to emphasize. I don't see that, mentioned very much.
Yeah.
But then again, like I said, I don't read the reviews. So hopefully,
We don't blame you.
Don't read the reviews. Just
Yeah, don't.
just
this is
sit.
really the major published reviews, and the major outlets.
Yeah. No, I don't blame
Also,
you.
find myself telling people, like, with those negative reviews, when they're like, oh, well, it made me uncomfortable, it made me angry, it made me whatever. I'm like, duh. It was supposed to. It was supposed to. That was the point, friend. It was supposed to make you upset. But let's introduce the show. This is Shelby.
Yes.
And this is Jess.
And welcome back to the League of Extraordinary Readers. As you guys can hear, we have the lovely Kim Coleman Foote here, the author of one of my all-time favorite books, Coleman Hill. It is a phenomenal historical fiction that covers the Great Migration. I can't think off the top of my head what other books talk about the Great Migration in this particular way.
12 Tribes of Patty was kind of started off. Yeah.
Yes.
And then
Jess I don't think Jess read that one.
I haven't read that one yet. No.
And I think I should know off the top of my head, but that was the major one, I feel like, in recent times that kind of set off Great Migration. Because I was working on this book around the same time, and I was like, not even seeing it as a book at that time, but, working on these different stories. And I was like, oh, someone's actually doing this. Someone has a Great Migration book out there.
Yeah. And
Angela Flournoy's first book. It touches on a little bit.
Turner House. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's true.
12 Tribes of Patty is really good. I need to reread that.
I need to read it.
That one's very good. And it reads similar to Coleman Hill as in a way where it feels like a bunch of short stories kind of being tied together through the familial line, right? Like they're all related. They all come from one woman, and then their lives, that was very good. The audiobook for that is also very, very, very good.
Yes. Very good. Very good. Very good.
But yeah, so we have a few questions for you, Kim.
Sure.
In the talking about the Great Migration, what made you want to tell the story about the Great Migration?
So that wasn't what I set out to do initially. It was more telling the story of my family. And I saw that you had another question prepared, which naturally comes up. How did Coleman Hill begin? It began with my great aunts. I was actually doing an assignment for my MFA creative nonfiction class where we had to use a photo as a prompt for an essay, I guess. And I chose a photo of my grandfather's three sisters as little girls. And the expression on the one in the middle just really struck me because she's
the one
like
with the puppy?
With the dog. The dog. Yeah, the dog. So she's just like has this nasty expression on her face. She's probably like 8 years old. And I was just like, oh my God, even then, this aunt, no one ever talked about her positively in the family stories. I was like, even then she was evil. And then I just heard this voice come out saying, I ain't afraid of that man or his camera. And I was like, oh. And I just got a notebook and a pen, and the words just flow. And I was writing for about 10 minutes straight. And when that story finished, I was like, now I know why she looks like that. Now I know why she looks like that. Something happened to this little girl at that age for her to have that expression on her face already. And I no longer saw her as evil from then. So for me, it was understanding why my family acted like they did, why they treated each other horribly, some of them, like this, to have all these scars for generations. that was the big concern, at the outset. And so like I've been doing genealogical research on my family as a hobby since I graduated from college. So this is, by the time I wrote that story, it was probably like 5 years out of college. And in the meantime, like this is before anything was digitized. There was no ancestry.com, there was no Google. There was Ancestry on a CD-ROM, which had, I don't even know what it had on it because nothing was digitized. You had to go to like the National Archives or a library and get microfilms and scroll through all these, census records and everything. But I had collected so many records on my family by then. And so I knew things like there were family members that people have forgotten, that maybe had died young or died a long time ago that were never ever mentioned in family stories. So I got to know all these new relatives and like contest, some things that had been mentioned about like ages and dates and things like that. So one of the first things that struck me was the very first census I found was from 1900, Alabama. And it was my great grandfather. And the only thing I knew about him from stories was that he died of lockjaw. And then he was working in construction and he fell off a ladder. He hit like whether it was a rusty nail pipe, like he got tetanus basically. And that just like struck me as a kid, imagining someone who cannot open their mouth, but that's the only thing I knew about him. I didn't know what year he died. I didn't know like, was it Irvington? Was it Newark? But he died falling off a ladder. He got lockjaw. And so to be able to find him on the census, I found it through his name because he had an unusual name. He was 14 years old. He was living in a rural, farm in Alabama, and he was already a farmer at that point, not in school, and I found out, oh, his mother's name. No one ever mentioned her name. He had a stepfather, he had sisters who were twins. He had like all these siblings living with him. Well, to find someone that you've heard in this anecdote, and now they're a 14-year-old child, and they're farming in rural Alabama with all these white families around. There were no Black families, in the vicinity. And this is like Jim Crow, like, South. And I'm just like, whoa, what was that like? And then to hear a story about his mother from extended family, that this woman was so bold that the white neighbor, his pigs kept coming under her house, and she got so mad that she threw boiling water on this white man's pigs. Number one. Number two, he comes to her with a rifle and puts it in her face. And she's like, pull it.
I know that's right.
I went there to Alabama. This is another thing I'm talking about in this book. There's resistance. There's some bold resistance, which you don't hear about a lot in trauma porn. You probably don't hear that at all in trauma porn, that someone fought back. And if they don't fight back, if they do fight back, it's like the fifth, 5 minutes left of the movie. But I went to that place where they lived in 1900, and I did not want to get out of the car today because there's Confederate flags around and all this stuff. I'm like, I'm staying in the car. But this woman, who was probably a small statured, dark-skinned woman in 1900 Alabama, lived to tell about a white man putting a shotgun in her face. And I was like, whoa. So to see these names and dates and how young people were and, the things that they would have gone through. I realized that both my great grandmothers were, I guess, like in their late 20s when they came up to Jersey, and both of their husbands died within a couple of years after they came up, and they had 5 kids each. What was that like? What was that experience like? So those are the things that kind of got me thinking, about my family. And then the Great Migration piece kind of came in because, I was looking at my own life experiences, in ways that I had been set back, myself, opportunities denied, fighting for better salary, fighting for promotions in my job and not getting them, and getting, passed over and all this kind of stuff, and seeing like my family's educational opportunities, work opportunities, and just realizing like, when people say, oh, pull yourself up by the bootstraps, and oh, as long as you just work hard. And it's like, no, we worked hard as slaves.
Right.
Which is why it's important to look at history, because we worked damn hard as slaves. And what do we get to show for it? Right? We still have lost property. We didn't get paid under slavery, right? And so then I started thinking about my family, like, okay, what was that like again to come from the South where, you're a sharecropper, you're a poor sharecropper. My great grandparents, their parents had been enslaved, and one of their parents came up, or two parents who were former slaves came up to Jersey with them, my great great grandmother and a great great grandfather. And I have a picture of my great great grandfather, and the fact that I can look at this man and know that, wow, when you were born, it was illegal for you to own your own body, right? Let alone be able to go to school, educate yourself, learn to read and write. You didn't even own your own body, and now you're in this new place where you can walk on the sidewalk next to white people and not have to step off into the street, and maybe you're going to get paid better. You can actually own a house. You don't have to keep sharecropping and, people, the landowner is lying to you about, the crops that you brought in, cheating you and all that kind of stuff. You can have a better way coming up to the north, but then things still aren't perfect here. There's racism still. You still have limited opportunities, seeing that the women were still domestics when they had been doing that since slavery times, so I was just starting to think, like, how does that affect people? How did that affect them in, combination with all the interpersonal family stuff that was going on?
When you talk about resistance, it makes me think about Clay Kane's new book, Burn Down Master's House. It has the most phenomenal introduction for a book that I've read in a long time.
You have to write down these recommendations and give them to me.
We'll send you a list. But he talks about how it was a choice that they didn't teach us about our ancestors that were rebelling, right? It's a choice. And not only because they were afraid of what that would do to us, but also what it would do to their children. And that this want to control history is not new.
Oh, of course not.
It's not new. It's something that's been happening, right? And
yes.
It's only 4 chapters in the book. It's not even a super long book, only 4 chapters. And he takes a rebellion that starts from one particular plantation from 2 characters, and that inspires the rest of these generations to also stand up for themselves and to do what they can to fight back. So it's important that we see, like, that's why it's important to read these books anyway.
Yeah.
It's so important. Yeah. So I love that. And I love that you mentioned the, like, spiritual aspect of it, right? That you you heard, I ain't afraid of that man and his camera. Like,
oh yeah.
I think we forget how spiritual art is in general, right? Yeah. I think that's the other reason why people don't maybe rate books in a way that makes sense, because they aren't realizing the work that it takes. Like, I'm constantly saying to people, like, this lived in their head and they were able to give it to us in a way that makes sense.
Yeah,
it reminds me and I knew it.
It reminds me of, like, what Zelda was saying, Zelda Lockhart was saying about Trinity and how spiritual that was for her. Yeah, you should definitely read it. It's in the same vein as your book a little bit, in the sense of, like, we're talking about multi-generational trauma and what that looks like from beginning to end. But she was talking about the spiritual aspect of it. So I can only imagine for you, especially connected to your family, how spiritual that was for you. It brings up the question of, like, what was the challenging parts of telling this story for you?
Yeah, I think the most challenging was to figure out what the motivations were, because, I only have limited stories, and like you were saying, Shelby, I think before, about your mother being like the sole kind of record keeper, like, how much do I trust that one perspective? Well, you can't, because everybody has a story and everybody sees things differently. So I was lucky to have different viewpoints, from different people, and contrasting viewpoints about why things happen or the way things happen. But then I had to figure out, because, like, again, this was something that I wanted to do myself, like, why they actually did these things to each other. And so when I had the earliest drafts, I I have a dear writing group friends. They would read my stories and be like, okay, but this is inconsistent. Like she's saying this over here, but then doing this over here, and then doing that over there. And I was like, yeah, because I don't really know. And they're like, but Kim, you're writing fiction. And I was like, yes, it's fiction, but this is a special type of fiction because it is about my family and I want to respect them. And again, I'm not putting out their business on the street to disrespect them and dishonor them. I really want to respect them, but also talk about their mess, and understand where that mess is coming from. And so like I would have to like literally create like a flow chart, and okay, she does this here, she thinks this here. What happened in this person's childhood, to influence this decision? So I'd have to like literally write it out for myself. This, if this, then this, and this and that, to think where this might come from. So that was the hardest. That was the
Okay.
hardest.
No, that makes sense because like you have a lot of moving characters and they
Yeah.
all connect. And I always wondered, this is also insight for us because I've always wondered how are authors writing multi-generational stories that connect well and
Yeah.
fluidly because I have read some stories that don't connect well.
Yes.
That I'm over here like I need a flow chart too to understand what is happening. So I like how you said you really had to do a lot more work to like
Yeah.
connect it and like
Yeah.
it shows like again the passion of like trying to make sure that we as readers understand it. And I think that's also plays into what we were talking about before. Like people also write that off
Hmm.
immediately because they're just not trying to keep up with characters. I've seen people say like
Sure.
I don't like
It's
too
too
many
many
characters.
characters.
I'm like, guys, it's
And I knew
not
I was
that
like, okay,
bad.
that's going to be the main complaint about this book. There's
Yeah,
too many characters, but you know
okay.
what? I love lots of peoples. I love
Hmm.
them. That's my thing. And certain, it's just like some things are not your flavor, right?
Yeah,
And that is okay. If you know you don't like multi-voice books, then don't read my book. But hey, read
that
my
part.
book because you might actually like it. You might
Yeah,
actually learn something because not every book is the same, right?
yeah,
Because I could say like, oh, I don't do experimental, I don't do this, I don't do it, and then I've read something that's just like blown me away, like Girl, Woman, Other, which is how I discovered Bernardine Evaristo. Like I'm like, oh my God, this book doesn't have like
yeah, yeah. That's a good
punctuation. I
one.
was just like,
Yeah,
oh no, I don't do experimental stuff. And I start
yeah.
reading that book, and I'm just like turning the pages. It was on a what do you call it? On my phone. I was reading
Okay.
it,
Yeah.
and I was just like flipping, flip. I was like, how am I reading this? It has no periods. I don't get it, but it's so engrossing. And I bought the physical copy because I was like, I just need to have it in my hands. So,
Hmm.
something might surprise you, but at the same time, like I said, for me, I don't believe that there's one story. I like the messiness of having all the different perspectives in there, and so for me, like I would say I one of my first books that I wrote when I was like, oh God, how old was I? Like 13, I think, had like multiple perspectives. I've always liked that style just to get like different people's stories and different character styles and perspectives. That, yeah, I love it.
No, I
do you
enjoy it too. I
still
think it's a great way. Oh, go ahead.
do you still have that first book that you wrote when you were like 13?
Hmm. Hmm. I have
Hmm.
everything but the very first story that I ever wrote when I was like 7.
That's so
Wow.
cool.
Actually. And I thought, all these years, I was like, wait, is that my own personal urban myth? That because I keep telling this story all these years, and I was like, but I don't have proof. I don't have evidence. And if you read Coleman Hill, there's that particular aunt who ain't always got the evidence. She got the
Yeah.
stories, but she don't got it on paper, right? And so I
Facts.
was
Yeah.
like, am I doing the same thing? But then I went back to like one of my earliest journals, and I mentioned, I was like, okay, I can trust
Yes,
myself. I
proof.
can make it. So, but yeah, I like physically remember like writing it and what happened in it, and yeah, but that's the only one that I don't have.
Oh,
No,
that's
it's
so
cool to
cool.
see a track of like where you started and where
Oh
you
yeah.
are now. Like to think about it, like I've always been a writer. You could be like
I've always
brag
liked
about that. I always
multiple,
been.
yeah,
Yep.
always like
Yeah.
multiple perspectives, yeah.
Yeah. Love it.
And
Love
talking
it.
about Black people and also the underdog, because that very first
Yeah.
story that I wrote was about a little Black boy, and this little Black boy was so pale that his friends would tease him,
Mm,
right? And so we usually hear about colorism in the context of being darker skinned and getting teased. But here's someone who's very light and getting teased to the extent that he's using his mother's brown makeup to feel accepted, right?
Mhm.
And like I said, I was about 7 years old at that point, grew up in an all Black town, but already seeing that there's this thing called colorism.
Right.
You
Listen, you
know,
got to tell the people it's in you. It ain't on you. This
hey,
Yeah.
been.
It's
This
been.
ain't new. It's been.
hey.
Do you plan to stick to writing historical fiction, or do you want to, dabble in some other genres?
Yeah, so my next novel is historical fiction as well. But like I was telling you guys before we started, this novel is also 25 plus years old right now. I actually started in 1999 when I was a college student on a study abroad program in Ghana. And when I was there, I had an intense experience at one of the slave castles, one of the oldest and largest slave castles in West Africa at Elmina. And basically, that place has just not let go of me since 1999. And the spirit said, "You're going to write this book. You're going to write this book." Because I've wanted to give up on it many, many times over these many, many years. But finished it first in 2010, and then it's just had a long, long trajectory of many revisions and revamps until we got to Coleman Hill. When I sold Coleman Hill, I actually was able to get a 2-book deal. And so this one will be book number 2, hopefully, knock on wood, coming out in 27. And it's called Saltwater Sisters. So initially I was thinking to write about the female experience of the slave trade because, I kept hearing like so many men this suffered and the number of men. And it is true that the majority of captives, which is also something that people might not know, the majority were men. But then you also had women, you also had children going through these experiences. And the women faced in a special hell because they could be raped, and bear the children of, the white people, other Black people, African people, whatever. But learning in Elmina that if women were pregnant, in these dungeons or like holding pens before the ships came, that they were not sold to get on the ships and cross the Middle Passage. They would actually remain in town and they'd be bought or, absorbed into local families. And so I wanted to know what that experience was like, for them. But then when I went back on a Fulbright fellowship for a year to do research for this novel, and I learned about Elmina. And Elmina is such a fascinating place with so much history and like just so much that wasn't being talked about at the time. Since then we've had Saidia Hartman's book, Lose Your Mother. We've had Jesse's Homegoing, that have kind of like gotten this information out there. But when I was starting this book, no one was talking about these complexities, excuse me, between the African people who were trading and the Europeans who were trading. And the fact that they had romantic relationships with women all up and down the coast of Africa. To this day, you have people who carry European names, and if you look at them and they didn't tell you their name, you think that this is like 100% African, whatever. Their DNA is going to come up with 100% African. And then you find out that, they're a Van Dyke, that they're a Williamson, they're a, whatever European name, whether it's Dutch, Portuguese, British, Swedish, Danish, German, because all these Europeans were there and trading back in the day. And so then I became interested in the experience of mixed race people in these towns because Elmina actually boasted the largest mixed race population. And contrast it with my experience in Elmina, where being my complexion, I felt like I was just like, and like, what do you call it? I just stood out with my complexion in Elmina and got stared at constantly, whereas back in the day, like people would have not looked at someone like me with my complexion because there were so many of them there. So that just got me thinking also about like, how things were manifesting today in Ghana, especially around the slave trade, where some of these people who are there don't know the history of these castles and they look at them as beautiful places. Because these tourists, from abroad, they're coming from so far, spending all this money. They spend all the money to get into this place. it must be a beautiful place. Amazing things happen there. And it's like, oh no, these people are coming to cry, over their ancestors. And to have Ghanaians like telling me pretty often, like, why do you people come here and cry? You should be happy your ancestors got put on a slave ship because they got sent to heaven. America is heaven. So why are you crying? And like, I can't tell you how many times people would say these things over and over again. And I was just like, oh my God. And so realizing like, oh wow, history can repeat itself. Like we can bring back the slave trade. Like you go into these dungeons and they have, markers saying never again, never repeat, man's inhumanity. And I'm just like, yeah, but if people forget what happened or they don't know what happened, which is clear in some of these towns, like the same thing can happen again. Because another thing that people used to say when I was in Ghana is that like, back in the day, you had to put people in chains to get them onto these ships. Today, if you put a boat here and said free passage to America, I don't know about right now, but before this current administration, free passage to America, and people would have like killed each other getting onto that ship. So I was like, ooh, like this could actually happen again because people don't realize, again, all these things that happened in the past. And so
Yeah.
history is very important to me. I love history. I love, again, the messiness, the stories. That's the real history. History to me is not talking about like mythological human beings, who wear capes and who never do any harm. They save people and they're just, this amazing human being. Because even that history that we've been told is a falsity, right? Because all these people that we've been told to revere, guess what? They had a dark side. And I think it's more interesting when we can talk about that complexity because that's what it means to be a human. Humans are not comic book. Well, sorry, my friend who's into comic books would say that there are some complex comic book characters out there. But the stereotypical, there's the villain and there's the good guy. Like humans are not that. Humans are a little bit of everything. And some people can be more skewed to one or the other, so that's why I love history, to really talk about those complexities and things that would just bog our minds to realize, wait, that happened in the past?
Yeah. It's funny that you say that about like when you were in Ghana, like people were telling you like, "Hey, why are you crying?" Because
Yeah,
like and, like our history in a sense is kind of global, but at the same time for them across the
it's
world,
not.
it's like
It's not.
the the free world is the free world. Like that's what they look at as like a ticket to get over to America because in a sense, yeah, we have a lot of better opportunities in a sense. There's more opportunities for you to get somewhere, but what they don't understand is that once you come over here, you're still in bondage some sort of way.
They don't
Um,
even realize, they didn't realize that racism existed. They didn't realize that apartheid
yeah,
existed here. When I would
yeah,
tell people, I was like, oh, you know about apartheid in South Africa? Like, oh, of course we know about that. I was like, do you know the same thing happened in the United States? They're like, what are you talking about? And like, it's called Jim
yeah,
Crow. What are you talking about? The after slavery, all of this stuff happened. And people were just like, what? Like people would actually say things like, and again, this is like not just one person, like hearing this repeatedly from people, they'd be like, oh, I noticed that you Black Americans, you do not associate with the whites. What did they do to you? And you're just like, you don't
How
know the
long do you
history.
have? How long do you have?
Exactly. You don't know.
yeah,
You don't know about the lynchings. You don't know about the lynching picnics where people took their families to watch Black
yeah,
men get brutalized and burnt. Like, it's just like, oh my God, it goes so deep. And you don't realize all the stuff. So Jessica, when you're saying our history is global, what history is that? Because they're getting the same
yeah,
history, the official capital H history that we're getting here. But we know because this is our lived experience, this is our ancestors' experience where, yes, we go to school, we learn about this president, that president, and all the good stuff that they did, but we know that person also had slaves,
yeah,
right? And that we even might carry the name of that person, who doesn't even recognize us as blood kin when we even are blood kin. So things like that is just like so much history that's complex that people don't realize. So I used to say it was like there they got like the ultra positive image
yeah,
of the
yeah,
United States.
exactly.
While here we got the ultra negative image of Africa, because then there's a converse side here, When I tell people, oh, I'm going to go live in Africa, and even Black people like, oh, you go live with the monkeys and the trees. And I'm just like, oh my God.
Yeah.
Because some people are just like, they've been taught to disparage their African ancestry. I was taught growing up, to not like my hair texture, to not like my color, even though I'm not considered dark by any means, but still taught not to like the fact that I'm brown. Right. And then to like gain this appreciation of my ancestry, of my hair, of my culture. And then to go to Africa and have people saying, stay out of the sun because you're too light and you're going to get dark like us. It's just like, oh my God. Or like, why don't you perm your hair? Right?
Oh, go ahead.
So colonialism, seeing how colonialism has affected them. And I was just like, oh my God, I need to write about this because my head's going to explode.
Yeah, I think it also like connects to like the South versus the North here in the States, right? Like the North is kind of taught that people down South is racist, mean, and country, and they don't know anything, and they don't have, the same things that we have. Where just like in Coleman Hill, they came north and realized, oh, it's here too. It just looks different.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It just looks different.
Even moving here from the South to the West,
Midwest, Midwest. I can tell you about Chicago.
Yeah, Chicago. Like it's a whole like here. I call it passive aggressive racism because they not really bold with it, but they're here. Yeah. They're doing their thing, right?
Those microaggressions. Sometimes not so micro.
I kind of sometimes wish it was just bold, so I just know what's happening here. But it's such an interesting. I even had a coworker. She was from Costa Rica, and we were talking one day, and she was working obviously in Costa Rica, and I think it was their Independence Day, and I was like, y'all don't got your Independence Day off, and that spiraled into us talking about history, and I'm like. Basically, she was saying, we get taught y'all's history. Do you know anything about ours? And I was like, no, not really, unless you do AP World like me. And that was like a chunk. Like you talk about China one week and then maybe a little bit of Africa and then you go to Italy another week. And so she was like, wow, we learned about Malcolm X. We learned about Martin Luther King. We learned about all these people, like everything about y'all's history, but you don't know nothing about ours. I was like, no, I didn't even know your Independence Day was today until you told me. And I wish you had it off. But she was like, no, we don't get it off because I work obviously for an American company and they don't really care that much. And I was like, that's true. And yeah, like she said, we know everything about your history.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Yep.
That is crazy.
In a way, like although it's terrible, it makes sense to me because the goal is always the American dream. So of course they're gonna teach you about the place that you dream to go, the land of milk and honey, right? Like of course they're going to put an emphasis on America because this is where everybody wants to go, and then they come here and realize it is also as well ghetto.
Yeah.
Well, in Ghana too, at a certain point, I was told that people learn more about rivers in England, who was their former colonial power, than they did in their own country. So that, because you also have people going to the former European colonies as well, and so England having colonized Ghana through 1957, you have a lot of people who go there as well, and they get a wake-up call. That, oh, we're not necessarily considered equal to these white people. And yeah, but there's just so much. And like I said, I had to put that in a book somehow. I also wrote a memoir about my experiences because I was like, okay, the novel cannot contain everything. And I had to talk about some of these extra things that happened. But that's the next book. It's looking at these two women in the 18th century. And I'm looking at the Dutch in particular. So they were resisting slavery in the 18th century. And then 1999, there's a biracial woman from New Jersey, who is fighting for reparations within her family. And so she goes to Ghana to track down an estranged uncle and a family heirloom. And that is the Saltwater Sister.
When the arcs are available, let us know.
I will, certainly.
Because I want to read it now. I'm excited.
It sounds really good.
I got when I was in Ghana, I did my Fulbright 2002 to '03, and it must have been 2002. I met some students from Spelman, I think, either Spelman or Howard on the University of Ghana campus. And I mentioned the book then. It didn't even have like the 1990, there was no present day part at that point, but it was just the past. And I told them, shit, they're like, can we get your autograph? I'm like, okay. It's like, this book is just a concept. I'm like here at the campus to do research. And I was like, I'm not anybody. Like, but you're going to be famous one day. And I was like, okay, here you go. Here's my autograph. There you go. So people have been waiting to read this book since before it was even written.
Yeah.
I love
So
that.
yes, and I have been
think
waiting to bring this book into the world for so long. So I'm hoping I can give it my best shot. I'm doing that right now as I finish it up.
I think
That's
it's
awesome.
gonna be a good one. I think about Tananarive Due as well. She said that about the reformatory. Like it took her, I think, 10+ years to write it, and
I would
she was
say
putting
10,
it
10
off.
years is like average, I
Yeah,
feel, to write a
yeah,
book. You know, when you have life, you know, if you're not a full-time writer, you have life, you have work they need to do for money. You might be raising kids, you might be taking care of other family members, et cetera, et cetera. You know, it
yeah,
takes a long time to write books, which again
yeah.
is why like people who just don't know that this is
Yeah.
intense labor that goes into a product like this. Not to mention if you need to do research on top of that.
Yeah, I think there's a new wave of authors that are writing books in 7 to 10 business days. That is
With
like
AI? With
warping.
AI or not with AI?
No, without AI. And some
Okay.
of them
Without a
are
some
some
with
of them
AI
are
too.
some with AI. I don't read those ones, but
I don't read those.
without AI, they are writing like
Hmm.
books in a month, right? I say 7 to 10 days to be facetious, but they're writing a book in a month, and it sometimes, although they're entertaining and they're, they serve their purpose, I also want them to dig deeper.
Yeah,
Like, what could this be if you spent a year on it?
sure.
Mm-hmm.
What could it be if you spent even 2 months?
Sure.
Yeah,
You know?
And you
3,
know, I'm
4
I'm
months.
gonna I'm not gonna knock it because if it entertained you, it
Oh yeah,
satisfied a
no.
purpose, right?
Oh
We
yeah,
love the girls. We love them. But I tell them often, I could tell you wrote this in 7 to 10 business days.
yeah.
Love the characters. Love it. It was
I used to
messy.
I
It
used
was
to call it like
romantic.
the lunchtime novel that you write on your lunch break.
Yep.
Yeah,
Yeah, basically.
yeah.
And I think they don't I think the goal is, because of social media, to become popular. And I
Mm,
think
Yeah.
there is a bit of the art that is missing, right?
yeah.
Like a bit of the depth that the authors that they aspire to
Hmm.
honor, right? Like Toni Morrison wasn't giving us something that she wrote at lunchtime, right?
Well, she would actually write on her steering wheel in the car.
That too.
But you know,
Hotels also, because she said she
it's the
couldn't write at
intent.
home.
It's the
Yeah, like
Yeah.
they
intent,
don't.
right? So like, I mean, and I would say just to say this, like everybody is not out to write a literary, you know, in-depth book.
That's
Again,
true.
some people are out to just like I'm like you said, I just want to be popular. Whatever I'm
Right.
putting out there, I don't care what the content is. I just want to do whatever I can to be popular. So there's all types. There's all types, you know, but like, yeah, that's not what I'm aspiring to do.
Yeah, I feel like they're gonna listen and be like, 10 years, 25 years.
Yeah.
They're
But a
gonna be
good
like,
art
oh,
takes
But
time. It
time.
takes
it's not,
time.
I'm just going to put this caveat out there. Like, it's not necessarily that I would say, yeah, it took me about, so from 1999, I finished it in 2010, right? But within that span, I also wrote a screenplay that was this
Mm,
novel. I wrote a memoir, a really, really long memoir, and published like 10 excerpts probably by then. I wrote another, did I write another novel? No, I had an idea for another novel. I wrote like poems. I wrote like parts of Coleman Hill in that 10 years. So I wasn't just like working on this one project. I did a whole bunch of things, plus moving all over the place, working, 9 to 5, all this kind of stuff. So that's why it took that amount of time. Now, why did it take from 2010 all the way until 2022 when I got my book deal? Because, I finished it. And, I won this prize and I won that prize and I won this prize and got this excerpt published. And I won a National Endowment for the Arts Literature Fellowship for an excerpt, but I could not break into the publishing, break that wall, and the thing that I was getting is like, people are like, oh, well, the writing is good, but I'm getting uncomfortable. Oh, there's too much violence, there's too many rapes, there's too much of the, and I'm just like, but other people are publishing all these other books that are being heralded, about slavery, about trauma, and about all this stuff. But mine all of a sudden is just too much. And so I think it was the way that I was, talking about slavery and racism and, the generational stuff out of that, and who was I looking at, like, in terms of who's the blame, for all of this stuff, because I don't let anyone get off the hook in this book. You have African players who are doing some dirt. You have European players who are obviously doing dirt, and then you look at the present day and how all that factors in. So I was pointing a lot of fingers, and I think people are just getting very uncomfortable, so I'm really just glad that, the time that I got when I was selling it, that the publisher, because it wasn't just my publisher, that I had a couple of publishers who were open to this work, but I think it was a time and the place, because this is coming after 2020. This is coming after George Floyd, and I think that's why also Coleman Hill got published, because I honestly believe that if that had not happened, I still would not have a book deal, because all of a sudden everyone wants to talk about racism and talk about slavery and trauma and all these kind of things. And so, I think that was a time when timing actually worked. So this had happened 15 years ago, I probably would have gotten a book deal. Even in the state, I'm not saying that book was perfect, because every time I work on it, it gets better and I can see the changes. I'm like, oh yeah, that was better. But how perfect does a book have to be? Because I look at so many things that get published and I'm like, man, if I were this book's editor, I would have got given 2 more rounds of this, because this could have been that much better. But mine had to keep going and get all this, So sometimes there's politics, that factor into why a book takes so long to get where it needs to be. But like I said, I'm grateful that all the timing came together and that my publisher actually backed this book and believes in it.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Jess, you want to do this or that real quick?
Yeah, we can do it. All right, so I'm just gonna give 2 scenarios and you just pick either one.
Okay.
Right? So Zora Neale Hurston or Toni Morrison?
Zora.
Handwritten draft or digital draft?
Now digital.
Okay. Would you rather reread your least favorite book every month or never write again?
Ooh, God. Reread the least favorite book. Jeez.
Every time she asks that question, my mind immediately goes to like, what is my least favorite book?
Yeah.
Oh no, I have them. I've given them away. No, excuse me, I've recycled them. Some were those lunch hour stories. Some were those lunch hour books. I was like, I can't.
Yeah. There's one that everybody else loves that's very popular right now, that every time I see it, I send it to Jess, and in caps, I'm like, yuck, ew.
I usually don't like the popular books that everyone likes, and then conversely will like something that, no one else is even aware of.
Same.
Right.
Yeah.
So like, again, everyone has their own different tastes. But no, I've read some really awful books and have not. I have a really awful book actually on my shelf. I'll tell you what it is after this episode. But but there's a story behind it. And I found it when I was in Ghana. And so it is still on my shelf, even though I tried to read it. I'm like, this is god awful, but it's still on my shelf because it is going to be a collector's item someday. Because but I'll tell you after. Jessica, it doesn't sound like you're from Jersey, but this will
I'm not
resonate with
reading.
Shelby.
That's
Just to say,
hilarious.
I that's how much I want to write, keep writing. That if you're gonna make me have that choice, fine.
All right.
It might take me a year to reread it, but I'd rather do
I'm
that
good.
than
I rather
give
do
up
that.
writing.
I get that. Have unlimited conversations with your character, with a character you wrote, or unlimited conversations with your favorite author.
Ooh, I'd say my favorite author because my character can talk all anytime. Yeah, we've already talked too much, in fact.
Well, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Stuck in your favorite fantasy world or your favorite time period?
Ooh, I'm gonna take fantasy world because I can do the time period without the Jim Crow. Because that's what I'm going back to the 20s, the dance floor, and we don't need Jim
Mhm.
Crow. So yeah, we can do that. Yeah.
What's
Yeah,
your favorite
yeah.
fantasy world?
No, it's gonna be the one that I make.
Oh, the one that you make.
So
Okay.
yeah, it's gonna be like the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, but like
Okay.
racially integrated, where no one's like
Yes.
the clan doesn't show up and try to break up the party, that type of thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's all I got. Those are some good answers. I like that.
They were. That was really, really fun.
Yeah.
Thank you again for coming to hang out with us.
Thank
We
you all
cannot
for having me.
wait.
It's been so much fun.
Good. We're glad. We
Yeah,
can't wait for
it
your
was
next
great.
book. And we will put all your social media and stuff down below and links to Coleman Hill so people can follow you and purchase and read one of the greatest
Great.
books out right
Oh,
now.
thank you, Shelby.
Yes. It's
You're
great.
welcome. We will see you guys next week.
Bye, guys.